A single cigarette takes 11 minutes off a life. Multiply that by the number smoked in human history, and the number stops making sense. More than 100 million people died from tobacco use in the 20th century alone. More than died in both world wars, the Holocaust, and the deadliest famines of the era combined. Some estimates place the toll of the 21st century even higher, if current habits hold. And yet, for most of its existence, this plant was not a killer. It was sacred. Long before it was sold in foil-lined packs beneath fluorescent gas station lights, tobacco was burned in ceremony. It was offered to gods. It was smoked to seal treaties, to heal the sick, to speak with the dead. For thousands of years, it was treated not as poison, but as medicine, a bridge between the human world and something larger. Something happened between the sacred fire and the vending machine. A 4th-century transformation turned a spiritual plant into the most profitable, most deadly consumer product ever manufactured. One built on slavery, empire, war, and a business model so effective it took governments decades to even admit the product was killing people. This is not a story about a bad habit. It is a story about how a single leaf helped build the modern world, and how the modern world spent a century learning to live with what that leaf actually cost. But that is not where this story begins. The story begins in the Americas, somewhere between 5000 and 3000 BCE, in the river valleys and highlands that would one day become Mexico, Peru, and the southeastern United States. There, among wild-growing plants in the nightshade family, humans first encountered tobacco, a broadleaf plant capable of altering consciousness when its leaves were dried, crushed, and burned. Archaeological evidence from Peru's Andean foothills places tobacco use as early as 5000 BC, making it one of the oldest psychoactive substances cultivated by human civilization, older than coffee, older than distilled alcohol, older than most written language. For the peoples who first domesticated it, tobacco was never a casual pleasure. It was treated as one of the most potent substances in the natural world, powerful enough to require ritual, restraint, and respect. Mayan carvings dating to the 1st century CE depict priests smoking rolled tobacco leaves during religious ceremonies, exhaling smoke as an offering meant to travel between the human world and the spiritual one. Among many indigenous nations across North America, tobacco was smoked in pipes during councils, treaty negotiations, and rites of passage. Its smoke considered a physical carrier of prayer, rising upward as a form of communication with the divine. It was also medicine. Indigenous healers used tobacco poultices to treat wounds, insect bites, and toothaches. Some groups believed it could ward off evil spirits or purify a space before a sacred act. It was chewed, snuffed, smoked in pipes, and in parts of South America, even absorbed through enemas in ritual contexts, a detail that underscores just how deeply embedded the plant was in daily and spiritual life. Crucially, tobacco was not an everyday indulgence in most of these cultures. It was reserved for elders, for ceremony, for moments that mattered. This is a critical distinction, because it means the addictive, compulsive relationship the modern world has with cigarettes did not exist yet. What existed was reverence. That reverence would not survive contact with Europe. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, his crew observed something they had never seen before. Local Taino people carrying dried leaves and inhaling smoke through hollow reeds. The Spanish had no context for this behavior. They didn't understand the ceremony, the medicine, or the spiritual weight behind it. What they saw was simply strange, and then almost immediately appealing. Within decades, sailors returning to Europe were bringing tobacco leaves and seeds with them, not as sacred objects, but as curiosities, medicine, and eventually commodities. It was never just a plant. It was about to become a global obsession, and the ritual object of one continent was about to be stripped down into the raw material of another. What looked ordinary was anything, but the tobacco that reached European ports in the 16th century was not yet the tobacco of modern cigarettes. It was raw, harsh, and difficult to use in the casual, repeated way that would later define addiction. Turning tobacco from a ceremonial rarity into a mass-market commodity required a series of innovations, each one making the plant easier to consume, easier to crave, and easier to sell. The first shift was in framing. European physicians in the 1500s, working with almost no understanding of the plant's actual chemistry, began promoting tobacco as a miracle cure. French diplomat Jean Nicot, whose name would later give nicotine its scientific title, sent tobacco seeds to the French court in 1560, claiming the plant could cure headaches, ulcers, and even cancer. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, reportedly used tobacco to treat her son's migraines. Within a generation, tobacco had a reputation across European aristocracy not as a vice, but as medicine sanctioned by royalty. This medical branding mattered enormously. It gave tobacco social permission to spread, from royal courts to universities to ports, under the guise of health rather than pleasure. The second shift was processing. Early tobacco was smoked in pipes, a method that was slow, communal, and limited in scale. Snuff, finely ground tobacco inhaled through the nose, became fashionable among the European elite by the 1600s, prized for its ritualized, almost theatrical use among nobility. But it was the development of curing techniques, particularly flu curing in the 18th and 19th centuries, that transformed tobacco's chemistry. Flu-cured tobacco produced a milder, more inhalable smoke that could be drawn deeper into the lungs without the harshness of earlier varieties. This single agricultural refinement mattered more than almost anything else in tobacco's history, because it meant nicotine could now be absorbed faster and more efficiently by the human body. Faster absorption meant a stronger, quicker effect. A stronger, quicker effect meant a stronger pull to use it again. The third shift was the cigarette itself, a format almost nobody had used in the plant's first several thousand years of history. Soldiers during the Crimean War in the 1850s observed Ottoman and Egyptian troops rolling tobacco in thin paper for quick, portable smoking between battles. British and French soldiers adopted the habit and carried it home. Unlike pipes or cigars, cigarettes required no elaborate preparation, no special equipment, and only a few minutes to consume. They were fast. They were disposable. They fit into pockets, into breaks between labor, into the accelerating rhythm of industrial life. It was never just about taste. It was about speed, convenience, and repeatability, the exact qualities that turn a substance into a habit. By the mid-1800s, the ingredients for mass addiction were already in place. A plant made milder through curing, a delivery method made instant through rolling, and a reputation cleansed of its ceremonial weight and rebuilt as a modern convenience. Tobacco was no longer a sacred object requiring restraint. It was becoming something else entirely, a commodity built for constant casual use. What began as prayer smoke was becoming pocket smoke, and the world's great trading empires were about to notice. By the early 1600s, tobacco had stopped being a curiosity. It had become currency. In 1612, an English settler named John Rolfe planted a strain of Caribbean tobacco seed in the swampy soil of Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America, and, at the time, a commercial disaster. Jamestown had been founded on promises of gold that never materialized. Colonists were starving. Investors back in London were losing patience. Rolfe's crop changed everything. Virginia tobacco, sweeter and milder than the harsh strains previously known in Europe, found immediate demand in London markets. By 1620, the colony was exporting nearly 120,000 pounds of tobacco a year. By 1680, that number had climbed past 25 million pounds annually. A colony that had nearly collapsed within its first 3 years was now the economic engine of England's presence in North America, built entirely on a plant that, 70 years earlier, Europeans hadn't even known existed. It was never just a crop. It was the thing that made Virginia worth keeping. Tobacco didn't just save a colony. It restructured how empires thought about land. Where Spanish colonization in the Americas had been driven primarily by the extraction of gold and silver, English colonization increasingly organized itself around agricultural commodities that required not conquest, but cultivation, and cultivation required land, and land required labor, at a scale no existing workforce could provide. Governments moved quickly to control the profits. The English crown imposed steep import duties on tobacco, turning what began as a colonial crop into a direct source of royal revenue. By the late 1600s, tobacco taxes were among the largest sources of customs income for the English government. Spain, controlling its own tobacco-producing territories in Cuba and South America, went further, establishing a royal tobacco monopoly in 1717 that gave the Spanish crown exclusive rights to buy, process, and sell tobacco grown in its colonies. Growers were forbidden from selling to anyone else. Prices were fixed by the state. An entire agricultural economy across Spanish America existed to serve one customer, the Spanish government itself. France followed a similar path, establishing its own state tobacco monopoly in the 1670s, which would remain in various forms for nearly 3 centuries. In each case, the pattern was identical. A plant that had once belonged to indigenous ceremony was now legally owned, taxed, and controlled by European crowns thousands of miles from where it grew. This is where the story widens beyond agriculture. Tobacco became a geopolitical asset, a resource states were willing to regulate, monopolize, and go to considerable lengths to protect. Ships carrying tobacco were escorted by naval convoys. Smuggling tobacco to avoid royal taxes became a serious crime, punishable in some jurisdictions by imprisonment or worse. Entire colonial economies, Virginia, Maryland, parts of the Caribbean, became functionally dependent on a single crop's global price, a vulnerability that would shape colonial politics for generations. By the 18th century, tobacco had become so central to Virginia's economy that it functioned as an actual currency. Colonial Virginia used tobacco notes, warehouse receipts for stored tobacco, as legal tender. Debts were paid in tobacco. Taxes were paid in tobacco. Ministers' salaries were paid in tobacco. A plant once reserved for sacred ceremony was now the literal measure of value in an entire society. But this expansion came with a demand that colonial planters could not meet on their own. Labor, at a volume and consistency that free workers were unwilling or unable to provide. That demand would be met through one of the most catastrophic systems of human exploitation in modern history. Tobacco did not merely enrich empires. It helped build the machinery of chattel slavery in North America. Growing tobacco is brutally labor-intensive. The plant requires constant attention across nearly a full year. Seedlings must be transplanted by hand. Worms picked off leaves individually to prevent damage, plants topped and suckered to control growth, and leaves harvested, cured, and sorted with painstaking precision. A single mistake in curing could destroy an entire season's crop value. This was not work that could be mechanized in the 17th century. It required hands, many of them, working constantly. Virginia's early tobacco economy relied first on indentured servants from England, workers who exchanged years of labor for passage to the colonies. But indentured servitude had a built-in expiration date, and by the mid-1600s, planters wanted a permanent, inheritable labor force that would never need to be released. The transition to enslaved African labor accelerated sharply after 1660, when Virginia's colonial assembly began passing laws that formally codified slavery as a hereditary, race-based institution. Laws written specifically to protect the economic interests of tobacco planters. By 1700, enslaved Africans made up a rapidly growing share of Virginia's tobacco workforce. By the eve of the American Revolution, tobacco plantations across Virginia and Maryland depended on the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. This was not incidental to the tobacco trade. It was foundational to it. The economics were brutally direct. Tobacco profits funded the purchase of enslaved laborers, and enslaved labor produced the tobacco that generated the profits. Some of the wealthiest tobacco planters in colonial Virginia, men whose names are still attached to universities, counties, and historical estates, built multi-generational fortunes on this cycle. Thomas Jefferson himself inherited a tobacco plantation worked by enslaved people, and tobacco debt would haunt his finances for the rest of his life. Tobacco did not merely fund plantations. It funded the ships that carried enslaved people across the Atlantic, the auction houses that sold them, and the legal systems that enforced their bondage. It was never just a crop. It was collateral in a system built on human suffering, a fact obscured for centuries by the tidy language of cash crops and agricultural economies. The human cost extended beyond enslaved labor in the Americas. In Spanish and Portuguese colonial territories, tobacco cultivation was frequently paired with coercive labor systems imposed on indigenous populations, who were required to grow specific crops for colonial administrators under threat of punishment. In the Philippines, under Spanish colonial rule beginning in the 1780s, the government imposed a strict tobacco monopoly that forced farmers in designated provinces to grow tobacco exclusively for state purchase at fixed, often exploitative prices, a system that generated enormous colonial revenue while impoverishing the farmers who grew the crop. Across 3 continents and nearly 2 centuries, a pattern repeats. Wherever tobacco became profitable at scale, coercion followed close behind. Free labor rarely produced it. Free choice rarely sustained it. This is one of the starkest truths in tobacco's history. A plant once used in ceremonies meant to heal and connect people became, under colonial capitalism, one of the primary economic engines of a system built on ownership of human beings. The moral weight of that legacy does not fade because the product eventually became legal, taxed, and normalized. It is stitched into the plant's global rise. But tobacco's transformation was not finished. The next revolution would not come from empires or plantations. It would come from a machine, and it would turn tobacco from a labor-intensive luxury into the most mass-produced consumer product on Earth. For nearly 3 centuries, cigarettes had one enormous limitation. They had to be rolled by hand. Skilled rollers in the 1870s could produce roughly 4 cigarettes per minute, a respectable pace for artisanal production, but nowhere near enough to make cigarettes a truly mass-market product. Cigars and pipe tobacco still dominated tobacco consumption. Cigarettes were a smaller, somewhat niche segment of the market, associated in parts of America with a slightly disreputable, bohemian image. Everything changed in 1880, when a 22-year-old inventor from Virginia named James Albert Bonsack patented a machine that could roll cigarettes automatically. The Bonsack machine was mechanically ingenious. It fed a continuous stream of shredded tobacco into a moving strip of paper, rolled it into a long tube, and then cut that tube into individual cigarettes at high speed. Where a human roller produced 4 cigarettes a minute, the Bonsack machine could produce over 200. Later refined models could exceed the equivalent of 120,000 cigarettes in a single working day. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a complete restructuring of the economics of tobacco. James Buchanan Duke, a young tobacco businessman from North Carolina, recognized what the Bonsack machine actually meant before most of his competitors did. In 1884, Duke licensed the machine and became the first manufacturer to fully commit his company to machine-made cigarettes. The results were staggering. Production costs collapsed. Retail prices dropped low enough for working-class consumers to smoke regularly rather than occasionally, and Duke's company began flooding domestic and international markets with cheap, standardized cigarettes at a volume no hand-rolling operation could match. It changed everything. Duke didn't stop at manufacturing. He pioneered aggressive, modern marketing techniques decades before branding was a formal discipline, inserting collectible trading cards into cigarette packs, running large-scale print advertising campaigns, and aggressively undercutting competitors on price to seize market share. By 1890, Duke's company controlled roughly 90% of the cigarette manufacturing in the United States, having absorbed or outcompete nearly every major rival into a single dominant entity, the American Tobacco Company. The scale was staggering for its time. Cigarette production in the United States rose from roughly 500 million units in 1880 to over 4 billion by 1895. What had been a labor-intensive artisanal product tied to slavery and plantation agriculture had become, within 15 years, a mechanized industrial commodity capable of saturating an entire national market. And soon, the world. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Duke's American Tobacco Company constituted an illegal monopoly under federal antitrust law, ordering it broken into several smaller competing companies. Among them, firms that would become household names for the next century: R.J. Reynolds, Liggett and Myers, and the American Tobacco Company's own successor entities. But breaking up the monopoly didn't slow the cigarette's momentum. It multiplied it. Now there were multiple well-funded companies competing aggressively for market share, each pouring resources into advertising, flavor development, and distribution, setting the stage for the most consequential era in the cigarette's history. The century in which it would become not just a product, but a cultural institution, a wartime necessity, a symbol of glamour, and, ultimately, a public health catastrophe that its own manufacturers understood long before the public did. The 20th century did not just normalize the cigarette. It weaponized it. World War I proved to be an unexpected turning point in cigarette culture. Tobacco companies donated millions of cigarettes to soldiers on the front lines, and military leadership actively encouraged the practice, believing cigarettes calmed nerves and boosted morale in the trenches. General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in Europe, reportedly stated that tobacco was as necessary to the war effort as food rations. By the time soldiers returned home, cigarette smoking had shifted from a somewhat marginal habit to a mainstream, even patriotic one, a habit millions of young men brought back into civilian life. This mattered enormously moving forward. It changed everything about who smoked and why. Through the 1920s and 1930s, tobacco companies began targeting a demographic that had smoked far less than men, women. Advertising campaigns explicitly linked cigarettes to independence, slimness, and modernity. A notorious 1929 marketing campaign for Lucky Strike cigarettes urged women to reach for a cigarette instead of dessert, branding the cigarette as a tool for weight control, a claim with no medical basis, aimed squarely at insecurities the industry itself helped manufacture. By the mid-20th century, cigarette advertising had become one of the most sophisticated psychological marketing operations in consumer history. Companies didn't just sell a product, they sold identity. Marlboro, originally marketed toward women in the 1920s, was completely rebranded in the 1950s around a rugged, hypermasculine cowboy figure, transforming it within a decade into the best-selling cigarette brand in the world. Camel used cartoonish, approachable branding. Virginia Slims tied smoking explicitly to feminist messaging with the slogan, "You've come a long way, baby." Each brand constructed an entire emotional world around a product whose core function was chemical dependency. What looked ordinary was anything, but behind the glamorous advertising, tobacco companies were accumulating internal scientific evidence about the health risks of their product years, in some cases decades, before that information reached the public. By the 1950s, independent medical researchers were publishing increasingly alarming findings linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. In 1953, a landmark study by researchers Ernst Winder and Everts Graham demonstrated that tobacco tar painted on the skin of laboratory mice caused cancerous tumors, a finding that sent shockwaves through the tobacco industry's leadership. Rather than respond with transparency, major tobacco companies responded with coordinated denial. In December 1953, executives from the largest American tobacco companies met in New York and, working with a public relations firm, crafted a unified strategy to publicly dispute the growing scientific consensus around smoking and cancer. In January 1954, this culminated in a full-page advertisement titled "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers," published in hundreds of American newspapers, which claimed there was no proven link between smoking and disease, a claim the industry's own internal researchers already knew to be false or at minimum seriously questionable. Internal documents later revealed through litigation showed that tobacco companies had conducted their own research confirming both the addictive properties of nicotine and its carcinogenic risks as early as the 1950s and 1960s. Research that was deliberately withheld from regulators, the medical community, and the public for decades. It was never just a marketing failure. It was one of the most extensive corporate deception campaigns of the 20th century, sustained by immense financial resources and executed with full awareness of the human cost. The consequences eventually caught up with the industry. The U.S. Surgeon General's landmark 1964 report formally and publicly confirmed the link between smoking and lung cancer, triggering the first wave of serious regulation. Mandatory warning labels in 1965, a ban on cigarette advertising on American television and radio in 1971, and a slow, decades-long erosion of the cultural glamour the industry had spent 70 years constructing. Litigation accelerated through the 1990s, culminating in the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, in which major tobacco companies agreed to pay U.S. states more than $200 billion over 25 years to settle lawsuits over the health costs of smoking-related illness. One of the largest corporate legal settlements in American history, and a tacit admission of decades of harm. The cigarette had gone from sacred smoke to colonial commodity to industrial product to global public health crisis. Each transformation layering new consequences onto a plant that for 100 years earlier had been treated with reverence rather than repetition. Today, cigarette smoking rates in wealthy nations like the United States and the United Kingdom have declined dramatically from their mid-20th century peaks, a genuine public health achievement, driven by decades of regulation, taxation, litigation, and shifting cultural attitudes. In 1965, roughly 42% of American adults smoked. By the early 2020s, that number had fallen below 12%. But the story did not end. It relocated. As regulation tightened and markets shrank across North America and Western Europe, major tobacco companies redirected marketing efforts toward developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Regions with weaker regulatory frameworks, younger populations, and rapidly growing consumer markets. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 80% of the world's more than 1 billion smokers now live in low- and middle-income countries, a demographic shift that mirrors, uncomfortably, the colonial-era pattern of wealthy nations extracting profit while distant populations absorb the risk. Tobacco remains one of the leading preventable causes of death worldwide, linked to roughly 8 million deaths annually, according to global health estimates, a number that includes not only smokers themselves, but hundreds of thousands who die from exposure to secondhand smoke. The plant's economic footprint also hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed shape. Tobacco farming remains a major agricultural export for countries including Brazil, China, India, and Malawi, where in some regions entire local economies remain structurally dependent on the crop, echoing the same economic entanglement that shaped colonial Virginia 4 centuries earlier. Meanwhile, the industry itself has continued to evolve, investing heavily in e-cigarettes and vaping products marketed as safer alternatives, a modern echo of the same reframing tactic used by 17th century physicians who once sold tobacco as medicine. The technology has changed. The core strategy of softening perception ahead of full scientific understanding has not. What began as a sacred plant, reserved for ceremony and healing, spent 4 centuries being stripped of its meaning, mechanized for profit, and marketed as identity, becoming, along the way, one of the most lethal consumer products ever manufactured, and one of the most historically revealing. Few objects trace the contours of empire, slavery, industrialization, and corporate power as precisely as the cigarette does. It was never just a habit. It was a mirror reflecting exactly what a society was willing to overlook for exactly how long and at exactly whose expense. A rolled leaf, smaller than a finger, helped finance a colony, deepen a system of slavery, build a monopoly, fund a legal empire of denial, and eventually cost more human lives than nearly any product in industrial history. It never announced any of that. It just sat there, ordinary, in a pack, on a shelf, in a pocket, waiting. That is, perhaps, the real lesson buried in this story. The most consequential objects in human history rarely look consequential. They look like habits. They look like commodities. They look, most of all, like nothing at all. If this changed the way you think about something as small as a cigarette, there are dozens of other everyday objects hiding histories just as enormous. And that's exactly what this channel exists to uncover. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling these threads. What part of this story surprised you most? Let us know in the comments. And if there's an everyday object you think deserves this treatment, tell us. We're already looking for the next one.